So, we are going to continue discussing about the different tools for using by the penetration tester for doing the authentication based attacks. In this module we are basically going to concentrate specifically on the SQL and the database part of it if the attacker decides to use these mechanisms for attacking a particular system. Now, one of the very common methodologies that an attacker penetration tester would typically try to employ if he basically wants to get access into a server that is really running a SQL engine or a database engine is what is typically called as SQL injection. As we all know, a database is something that actually stores and organizes data in an organized manner, so that I could basically go ahead and do a very simple query by which irrespective of the number of entries that my database has, I will be able to get a very optimized and a very quick output of the entry. Some of the very common databases we would have actually heard of quite a few database softwares that are very popular in today's market. So, you have Postgres SQL, you have Microsoft SQL, you have Oracle and so on. So, we find that generally of late there are lot of installations that are either getting ported into Postgres SQL and also there are quite a few installations of Microsoft SQL and Oracle as well. So, it basically these kind of database management systems allow the users to create multiple databases, and then for each database, as most of us would know, you could potentially have multiple tables created on which we store the data, we query the data subsequently after storing, we then modify the data and so on and so forth, right. Once the database is actually created and stored, we typically have what is called as a structured query language or in short referred to as an SQL, which again we would most of us would actually have experienced in some form or other till now. SQL is basically a sort of a programming language that could actually be used for doing different kinds of database operations, right. So, be it creating a database or creating a table or inserting a new entry or inserting multiple entries in one shot or updating certain entries or deleting some entries, for all these purposes you could actually write a different SQL queries. So, SQL in short is basically a programming language, you could consider it as a programming language that you could make use of for doing different kinds of DB operations. So, having known what kind of database is installed on what server and what is the operating system that is running on the server, and also the version of that particular database, the attackers actually have the necessary information to find out how those vulnerabilities that are existing in those databases could potentially be made use of, right. So, attackers basically do different things depending on these factors. So, first factor is what is the operating system on which the database is installed, what is the version of the operating system, number 3 what database is actually being used, number 4 what is the version of that database that is actually installed and being used on that particular system, right. Based on all these parameters, it is very easy for attacker to have a list of possible vulnerabilities that particular database could be potentially having, which he will basically try to exploit, right. So, what could be the different vulnerabilities? You could basically try to ask for some privileged information directly from the database management system, or else he could basically try to make use of possibly some poor configurations which has been done by the database administrator. So, suppose if the database administrator is not very experienced and he is not aware about what are the different things that on a particular database it has to be taken care of and plugged from a security point of view, then that administrator could be expected to have kept it open, which the attacker would try to actually make use of. Attackers may also take advantage of a vulnerability in the database management system that allows the attacker to view or write privileged commands to and from the database. So, once these privileged commands are written or executed, they could potentially get access to certain authentication information with which they will be able to access the database with full control, right. So, for example, if a sysinfo is the name of the place where all the user credentials are actually stored along with other information, right. If the penetration tester is able to successfully query this particular location and then get all the details, right, then for doing a valid login into the database, the attacker would actually have all the details available with him, right. So, the attacker would try to see if that is something which could be exploited by him. And then another way is typically the attackers would try to use is sort of send a malicious code either through basically a database SQL form or other parts of the web page that basically has the ability to accept the user input, right. So, if I basically give a certain user input as part of my database form that is going to be getting sent into the DB server, and as part of this user input if I do some malicious code execution on the DB server, that has the possibility of the attacker getting some sort of a privileged access into the database, right. So, these are the different types of things that the attacker would typically try to do. Now, what exactly also the attacker could try to do is the attacker might try to, for example, enter random characters or maybe some sort of a long statements by which the attacker will try to find if there is some sort of a weakness that he could find out on the database that has actually been set up and administered at the remote DB server, right. So, if for example as it is given here, if an input field is set to only accept usernames up to 15 characters, if I basically try to give maybe a very long string and as part of this response back, right, if I am basically getting a message, it will basically try to give an indication to the attacker on what kind of things he could potentially do, right. So, we will see one example subsequently in the next slide, but one of the Firefox plugins, so we had actually seen a few Firefox plugins before. So, one of the Firefox plugins called Hackbar is something that will actually help us to test the SQL injections in this manner, right. So, I could write an SQL query and inject the query by putting in a form some form of an SQL request into the DB server, right. So, it will also, this particular plugin will also help it will basically help the attacker to sort of examine what is the HTTP post information that is actually getting generated and sent to the DB server, and is there any possibility of it to get modified. So, we will actually try to perform an SQL injection on a website called drcovers.com. So, if you actually try to navigate to this website using Firefox a browser on our Kali server, we will actually try to log into the website. So, when we log into the website, so let us try to actually attempt giving the username as administrator and the password as a 12345 string. So, this is obviously an invalid password, but we are deliberately giving it to see what kind of a response message that the server at that particular URL is giving me back, right. Now, if I basically go to the view menu in the Firefox bar and select the Hackbar plugin, it will basically give me a load URL button that I could potentially click on, and then I will be able to see the username and password that we actually just attempted to enter as part of the response from this load URL button, right. So, if you see here, I basically have the thing that is actually printed as part of whatever got sent in as the post data, right, which was actually given by typing in randomly the username as administrator and the password as 12345. Now, when I actually given this response, because of the fact that it is actually an incorrect password, it is basically, if I now give as part of the post command deliberately a single quotation mark, right, after the administrator username. So, I just type a single quotation alone. So, typically what is expected is that whenever you have a single quote or a double quote, it is expected that there will be a corresponding closing single quote or a double quote appropriately. So, if you have used a single quote, the closing quote also will be a single quote, and if you have used a double quote, the closing quote also will be a double quote. But here the attacker is deliberately giving only one single quote, forcing the server to give back a message. Now, depending on the message that is given back, the attacker has the possibility to know if that particular server has the potential to get attacked by doing an SQL injection. So, now when we do this kind of an thing and then say execute, now we get a message back saying that you have an error in your SQL syntax, check the manual that corresponds to MySQL server version for the right syntax to be used. Now, it is this message the attacker comes to know that the server is basically responding back with a message, and that means it is doing a SQL query execution, right. Now, when it is doing an SQL query execution, one of the things that is actually required is some sort of a true statement. So, now what kind of an SQL injection the attacker could try to attempt here as an example, right. So, the attacker could actually also have more complicated SQLs injected as well, but here as an example, if the attacker basically adds a string saying or 1 is equal to 1, okay, at the end of the line. Now, if you look at it here, just or 1 is equal to 1 has actually been added. Now, what actually happens is this becomes true because 1 is always equal to 1. Now, when this kind of a modified SQL query, which is basically what is referred to as an SQL injection, is sent to the server by again pressing the execute button of this plugin, we find that the administrator is successfully logged in into the portal of that particular URL that was attempted to be logged in by the attacker, right. He now get to see the dashboard screen that is actually is the opening screen of the portal that the attacker was actually trying to log in, and once he has got access to the dashboard of this particular URL, it is basically like as if he is an administrator and he can actually do whatever he wants on this particular URL right now, right. So, he could modify the content, he could destroy the content, he could put his own picture or do whatever he wants, right. So, this is an example of how something like an SQL injection could happen. Now, there is a command called SQL Map, which is again an automated way of trying to find out and detect and exploit whatever are the different possible SQL injection flaws that could potentially happen on that server, right. So, this is more like a Sql command that you could use for doing the automation of trying to find out the different kind of possible SQL injections that could be attempted on that server, and the attacker will hope that at least one of those different attacks that is being done by this particular SQL map after detecting the list of potential vulnerabilities is successful, and with this successful attempt he is able to get access into the. So, it could basically do a lot of things, it could do a lot of SQL injection, it actually has different techniques that it could attempt to follow. It could actually try to act as if it is different users, it could do password hashes, it could do lot of such operations which gives a foothold for the attacker to get access into the system. We will actually see how this is something that could be made use of. So, the SQL Map tool is something that will be available under the vulnerability analysis of Kali Linux under the submenu option of database assessment, right. As I was telling you, these different tools that we are talking in this particular session is something that is related purely to database, and that is the reason why you find it under database assessment submenu option under the Kali Linux menu. So, we basically say SQL map minus u URL. So, this is basically the URL of what we want to what the attacker wants to attack, and then followed by the function. Now, this function has various possibilities, different ways of actually using here. So, one of the very common function first that an attacker will actually try to do is use DBS, right. So, DBS basically stands for databases. So, the attacker basically tries to run the command as SQL map minus u followed by the URL and say minus DBS. It will basically try to do the listing of all the databases that is actually available as part of this URL if it is able to successfully get that list, right. So, for example, we find that there are these are the databases that it is actually listed as part of running this command. Now, there are other ways also of running this command. So, once we get the list of databases, the next thing that the user will want to do is to get the list of tables inside a database, right. Once the list of databases is known, the attacker will basically use the minus d option to this particular command, give the database name and then specify the function as tables, minus tables, right. So, this minus tables function will list all the tables that is actually found in this particular database called test when the attacker is actually using it in this form. So, this will basically list down all the tables that is there in this particular database, and once the tables are listed, the attacker could potentially make use of minus columns, right. So, this will basically go ahead and list out all the columns that is there in a particular table that has been actually queried. So, in this way the attacker using an SQL map will be able to find out what are all the different columns that is there. If we actually try to look at the different other forms of usages by which this SQL map tool could be used, we find it is extremely sophisticated for the attacker to get more details about that particular system with which he can extract as much data as possible out of that particular system, right. These are some ways by which an attacker could potentially make use of for getting details about a particular database or a set of databases on the remote system that he is trying to attack. Thank you.